The echo of a boot against a man's ribs is a sickening hollow sound. In the cold, sterile light of the transit station, that sound was punctuation to a sentence of brutal injustice. For the two officers delivering the blows, it was just another night, another vagrant learning his place. They did not know the man on the ground. The man they were beating for the crime of existing in their space was not just another forgotten face. They did not know his name was Samuel Kane. And they had no idea that the very station they worked for, the uniforms on their backs, and their entire careers belonged to him. The air in the transit station was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 hurried footsteps. It was a place of transition, a concrete and steel purgatory where people were always on their way to somewhere else. This evening, however, the usual thrum of the city had subsided to a low electric hum. The remaining population consisted of the tired, the lost, and those with nowhere else to go. Samuel Kane belonged by appearance to the last category. He wore a simple, well-worn charcoal hoodie, frayed jeans, and scuffed work boots. His face, etched with lines of thought rather than age, was covered by a few days' growth of beard. He sat on a cold, hard bench, a tattered copy of a philosophy book resting unread in his lap. He was not reading, he was observing. This was his ritual. Once a quarter, Samuel, the founder and CEO of Aegis Metro Security, the multi-million-dollar private firm contracted to protect the entire Metropolitan Transit Authority, would shed his tailored suits and expensive watches. He would don the clothes of the overlooked and immerse himself in the world his employees were meant to serve and protect. He called it a ground truth assessment. He needed to see his company not from the sterile comfort of a boardroom, but from the perspective of the people who relied on it every day. He needed to see the cracks in his own creation. This evening he saw two of them approaching. Officer Vance Harlan and Officer Tanner Brooks moved with the kind of swagger that came from believing they were the ultimate authority in their small kingdom. Harlan was a mountain of a man, his uniform stretched taut over a frame built by years of lifting weights and a poor diet. His face was perpetually flushed, a mask of simmering aggression. Brooks was his wiry, fidgety counterpart, a man who seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, his eyes darting everywhere, looking for a challenge. They were a known quantity in the company's internal reports, though nothing ever stuck. Complaints against them were frequent but always ended as unsubstantiated. They were masters of the gray areas of escalating situations, just enough to justify their actions in a report written in the sterile, passive language of law enforcement. Samuel watched them from under the brim of his hoodie. They hassled a young woman for having her feet on a seat, their tone dripping with condescension until her boyfriend, a kid built like a linebacker, stood up. They immediately softened, their bravado deflating into grumbled warnings. They bypassed a group of loud, boisterous college kids, clearly intoxicated, choosing not to engage. Then their eyes fell on Samuel. He was the perfect target. Alone, quiet, dressed in a way that suggested he had no one to call and no resources to fight back. "Time to move along, pal," Harlan's voice boomed, intentionally loud in the near-empty station. Samuel looked up slowly, meeting Harlan's gaze. He did not move. He simply asked in a calm, quiet voice, "Since when? The schedule posted online says the platform is open." The simple act of questioning them, of not immediately complying, was like a lit match in a room full of gas. Brooks stepped forward, placing a hand on the nightstick at his hip. "You got a problem with hearing, or you just like the sound of your own voice?" the officer said. "The officer told you to move it." "I'm just waiting for the last train," Samuel replied, his voice still even. "The eastbound. It's on the board." He gestured with his head toward the flickering electronic timetable. This was part of the test. Would they engage respectfully? Would they verify his information, or would their authority, once challenged, become a blunt instrument? Harlan's face darkened. He saw not a passenger asserting his right to be there, but a derelict defying an order. "The board is wrong now," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I am not going to tell you again. Get up and get out, or we will make you." Samuel held his ground. He needed to see how far they would push for the sake of the hundreds of other people who might not have his resources, who might face this same arrogance every day. He needed to know. "I am not breaking any laws," Samuel stated, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I am a paying passenger in a public transit area waiting for my train. I have a right to be here." The word right was the final spark. Brooks laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Oh, you got rights now, do you? Let's see your ticket." Samuel reached into his pocket and produced a valid paid fare card. Brooks snatched it, looked at it as if it were a forgery, and then threw it onto the grimy floor. "Ticket's on the ground and you're loitering. That's enough for me," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He unclipped his own nightstick, the metallic click echoing in the silent station. "Last chance. Walk out of here on your own 2 feet." Samuel looked from the sneering face of Harlan to the agitated eyes of Brooks. He saw the truth of his company right here on this cold, unforgiving platform, the policies he wrote, the training modules he funded, the mission statement he had penned himself about community, safety, and respect. They were all just words. They had died somewhere between the boardroom and this bench. He slowly began to rise, not to leave, but to stand his ground as a man. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low and steady. Harlan took it as a final act of defiance. "You're right," he spat. "We do not have to. We get to." And then he swung. The first blow was not with the nightstick. It was Harlan's open hand, a slap that cracked across Samuel's face with the sharp report of a firecracker. It was designed to humiliate, to shock, to put him back in the box they had already built for him in their minds. Samuel's head snapped to the side, a ringing in his ear, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth where his teeth had cut his cheek. For a split second, the world tilted, the raw animal instinct to fight back, to unleash the fury that simmered beneath his calm exterior, surged through him, but he crushed it. Violence was their language, not his. Answering in kind would only validate their narrative. The report would write itself. Subject became aggressive, requiring a physical response. He straightened up slowly, turning his head back to face them. He did not speak. He just held their gaze, his eyes a mixture of pain and profound disappointment. This quiet defiance was more infuriating to Harlan and Brooks than any scream would have been. "Resisting, huh?" Brooks snarled, stepping in to close the distance. "You want to play tough?" "I am not resisting," Samuel said, his voice slightly slurred. "I am standing." That was when the first punch landed. Brooks, quick and vicious, drove his fist into Samuel's stomach. The air exploded from Samuel's lungs in a pained gasp. He doubled over, and Harlan took the opportunity to shove him hard. Samuel stumbled backward, his legs tangling, and he fell heavily against the unforgiving concrete floor. His book skittered away under the bench. The world was a kaleidoscope of spinning ceiling lights and the grimy tiled floor. He tried to push himself up, but a boot, Harlan's boot, planted itself firmly in the center of his back, pinning him down. "Stay down," Harlan roared. From the corner of his eye, Samuel saw a third officer, a younger man named Wyatt Dunn, hovering near the station entrance. Dunn had been on the job for less than a year. He was watching, his face pale, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was a witness. He was also silent. His silence was its own form of violence, a quiet endorsement of the brutality unfolding before him. "Check his pockets," Harlan grunted to Brooks. "Bet you he is holding something." Brooks knelt, his movements rough and invasive. He tore through Samuel's pockets, pulling out a cheap, untraceable burner phone, a set of keys, and a thin leather wallet. He flipped open the wallet, expecting to find nothing. What he found instead was a small, neat stack of $100 bills and a single platinum credit card with no spending limit. Brooks's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. This did not fit the profile. Vagrants did not carry platinum cards. He quickly concealed his surprise. He pocketed 2 of the $100 bills with a sleight of hand he had perfected over years, then tossed the wallet back onto the floor near Samuel's head. "He has got nothing," Brooks announced to Harlan, the lie hanging in the air. "Then he has got no reason to be here," Harlan said, pressing his boot down harder. Pain shot through Samuel's spine. You are trespassing on transit authority property, and you are resisting arrest. I have not been arrested, Samuel forced out, the words muffled by the concrete. You have not stated any charges. This pedantic adherence to the law seemed to enrage Harlan more than anything else. He lifted his boot and delivered a sharp kick to Samuel's ribs. A sickening crack echoed in the station. Samuel cried out, a raw, involuntary sound of agony. A rib had just broken. The pain was a sharp, white-hot fire searing through his side with every breath. It was then that Harlan finally drew his nightstick fully. He held it not like a tool of law enforcement, but like a club. I think he needs a little more persuasion, Tanner, Harlan said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Brooks drew his as well. I think you are right, Vance. They stood over him, two dark figures silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights. To them he was nothing, a piece of trash to be swept away. They did not know they were standing over the architect of their entire world, the man who signed the checks that paid for their weapons, their uniforms, and their salaries. They were two wolves baring their teeth, unaware they were attacking the master of the forest. Samuel closed his eyes, bracing himself. The cold of the floor seemed to seep into his bones. He heard the whistle of the nightstick cutting through the air, and then a blinding flash of pain as it connected with his shoulder. Another blow landed on his thigh. They were careful, avoiding his head, leaving marks that would be covered by clothing. It was a practiced, methodical beating. Through the haze of pain, one thought kept him anchored. Let them. Let them show me exactly who they are. Let them give me all the evidence I will ever need. Every strike was a nail in their own coffins. Every kick was a signature on their termination papers. And the silent complicity of the young officer watching from the sidelines was a testament to the cultural rot Samuel now knew he had to carve out of his company, no matter the cost. The assault ended as abruptly as it began. The distant rumbling approach of the eastbound train served as an unwelcome interruption. Its arrival would bring a handful of new witnesses, and the officer's cruel playground would be spoiled. You are lucky, Harlan grunted, nudging Samuel with the tip of his boot one last time. Train is here to take you back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Brooks spat on the ground near Samuel's head. Next time we tell you to move, you move. Understand? They did not wait for an answer. With their authority asserted and their sadism sated, they turned and walked away, swaggering back toward the main concourse as if they had just handled a major threat to public safety. Officer Wyatt Dunn lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Samuel's. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Fear, guilt, maybe even pity, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned and followed his senior officers, a shadow in their wake. For a long minute, Samuel lay on the cold floor, the only sounds the pounding in his head and the squeal of the train's brakes. Pain was a living thing inside him, a hot coil tightening in his chest with every ragged breath. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs screamed, and a deep purple bruise was already blooming on his thigh. But beneath the pain, a cold, hard clarity was setting in. The train doors hissed open and a few weary passengers disembarked, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding the man crumbled on the platform. They saw him, but they chose not to. In a city of millions, invisibility was a survival mechanism. With a monumental effort, Samuel pushed himself up. The world swam, a nauseating blur of white tile and yellow warning lines. He leaned against a pillar, his body trembling with a mixture of pain and adrenaline. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cheap burner phone. It was cracked but functional. He did not call emergency services. Calling the city police would create a jurisdictional mess and a mountain of paperwork that Harlan and Brooks could navigate and manipulate. They would be investigated by their peers, a brotherhood that often protected its own. That was not the path to true accountability. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. "Catherine." "It's me," Samuel said, his voice a hoarse whisper. There was a pause on the other end. Catherine Beck, the chief operating officer of Aegis Metro Security, could decipher a crisis from a single syllable. She was Samuel's most trusted colleague, a former federal prosecutor with a mind like a steel trap and a loyalty to Samuel that was absolute. Samuel, where are you? What is wrong? The concern in her voice was immediate, cutting through her usual unflappable calm. Northline Station, Platform B, he managed to say, leaning heavily against the pillar. We have a problem, a ground truth problem. That was their code. It meant the rot was real. How bad? She asked, her voice already shifting into operational mode. He could hear the faint sound of keys clicking in the background. She was already working. Code red, Samuel said. The term was reserved for the most severe breaches of protocol, incidents involving extreme misconduct or criminal action by their own personnel. The clicking stopped. Samuel, are you hurt? They broke a rib, I think maybe more, he said, the admission costing him. Officers Harlan and Brooks. Dunn was present, non-participant. A heavy silence followed. It was the silence of controlled fury. Catherine knew the names. Harlan and Brooks were a recurring decimal in her internal affairs reports. She had wanted them gone for months, but they were slippery, always leaving just enough doubt to survive a review board. Okay, Samuel, do not move. Do not talk to anyone else. I am dispatching a private medical team to you, not an ambulance. They will be discreet. I am also dispatching our internal response unit to secure the station's CCTV footage from the last hour, every angle. I will be there in minutes. Catherine, Samuel said, his voice tight. The body cams. I will get them, she said, her voice like ice. The live feed would have been disabled, but the device's internal storage would have it. They would claim it malfunctioned. They always do. It will not matter. We will retrieve the data. Good. Samuel breathed, relief washing over him, though it did little to dull the physical pain. One more thing, Catherine. Anything. Harlan, Brooks, and Dunn. Do not detain them. Just issue a priority summons. Mandatory debriefing. Tell them it is regarding a platform incident. Let them walk into the lion's den on their own 2 feet. Let them come in confident. Let them think they won. Catherine understood immediately. Consider it done. I am on my way. The line went dead. Samuel slid down the pillar to a sitting position, the cracked phone slipping from his grasp. The last train had departed, leaving the station empty once more. The stage was now set. The actors had played their parts, and the director, bruised but resolute, was about to change the script for good. Catherine Beck moved with the efficiency of a natural disaster. Within minutes of her call with Samuel, a silent, powerful machine had roared to life. A discreet medical team, the kind used for high-profile clients who valued privacy above all, was en route to the station. A tech team from Aegis headquarters was remotely accessing the Transit Authority's servers, legally and swiftly, using the emergency override clauses in their contract. A second team was already driving to the station to physically secure the hardware. Catherine herself was a blur of motion. She threw on a sharp black pants suit, her mind already several steps ahead. She issued the priority summons for officers Harlan, Brooks, and Dunn. The message was deliberately vague. Mandatory administrative debriefing regarding an incident at the station. Formal uniform required. The location was key. It was not where disciplinary hearings were held. That was a lower floor, a place of drab rooms and union representatives. This was the executive level. It was where deals were signed and corporate strategy was born. It was Samuel's domain. Sending them there was a calculated move designed to confuse and disarm. Meanwhile, back at the station, Samuel was being attended to. The medics were quick, professional, and silent. They confirmed a fractured rib and severe bruising, dressing his wounds with practiced hands. They helped him into a clean set of clothes Catherine had sent with them, simple dark trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. It was a transformation. The forgotten man was gone, replaced by someone who, despite his injuries, radiated an aura of quiet power. By morning, Samuel was sitting in his own office on the executive floor, a tablet in his hand. The first batch of CCTV footage was streaming in. Catherine stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression grim. There it was in grainy, high-definition black and white. The whole sordid affair, the shove, the kick, the sneering faces, the nightsticks, and in the background, the silent watching silhouette of Officer Wyatt Dunn. Their body cam footage is being extracted now, Catherine said, her voice tight with anger. "The local storage was not wiped. Arrogance makes you sloppy. It always does." "It always does," Samuel replied, his eyes fixed on the screen. He was not watching his own beating. He was watching the hubris of the men who worked for him. He was watching the failure of his own system. In the morning, officers Harlan and Brooks stood in front of the gleaming, imposing Aegis Tower. They were in their best pressed uniforms, shoes shined, radiating a cocksure confidence. "Executive floor," Brooks said with a low whistle, looking up at the skyscraper. "Must be about that bum we tossed off the platform. Guess he filed a complaint. Bigwigs probably want to give us a commendation for keeping the stations clean." Harlan grunted in agreement. Kid gloves. That is the problem with this company. All about de-escalation and community outreach. A little old-school policing is what this city needs. Maybe they are finally figuring that out. They saw Officer Wyatt Dunn waiting nervously by the entrance. He looked like he had not slept. "Relax, kid," Harlan said, clapping him hard on the back. "This is a good thing. You kept your mouth shut. You did good. Just follow our lead. We say he was belligerent, non-compliant, probably high. We felt threatened. We used necessary force to subdue him. Simple." Dunn nodded mutely, but his eyes were full of a dread that Harlan and Brooks were too arrogant to notice. The three of them rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the executive floor. The doors opened not to a dingy hallway, but to a vast open space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The floors were polished marble. The furniture was sleek and modern, and the air hummed with a quiet, intimidating power. A receptionist with an earpiece directed them to the main boardroom. "This is nice," Brooks muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. This was not a debriefing room. This was where kings of industry held court. They were led to a massive mahogany table that could seat many. At one end sat Catherine Beck, her expression unreadable. Beside her were two people in severe dark suits whom they correctly identified as corporate lawyers. "Officers, thank you for coming," Catherine said, her voice cool and formal. "Please have a seat. We are just waiting for the head of the board." Harlan and Brooks took their seats, trying to project an air of nonchalant authority. Dunn sat stiffly, looking at his hands. They waited. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed to magnify their unease. After long minutes, the door at the far end of the room opened. A man walked in. He was wearing dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. He moved stiffly, a slight wince with every step. His face was bruised, a cut visible on his lip, and a dark shadow of a contusion bloomed on his cheekbone. It was the man from the platform. Harlan and Brooks stared, their minds refusing to process what they were seeing. The bum, the vagrant, the piece of trash they had beaten and kicked, was here in the executive boardroom. How was this possible? Did he have a rich relative? Was this some kind of setup? The man did not look at them. He walked slowly to the head of the table, to the large empty chair that was clearly the seat of power. He sat down, his movements deliberate. He placed his hands on the table and finally lifted his gaze, his eyes locking with theirs. The cold, analytical fury in that gaze stripped away the last vestiges of their arrogance, leaving them exposed and terrified. Catherine Beck broke the silence. Her voice was sharp, each word a perfectly crafted dagger. "Officers Harlan, Brooks, and Dunn," she said, "allow me to introduce you. This is Samuel Kane. He is the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Aegis Metro Security. He is the man who owns the station you work for. He is the man you assaulted last night." The silence that followed Catherine's introduction was so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The air in the opulent boardroom seemed to crystallize, trapping Harlan and Brooks in a moment of pure, undiluted horror. Their worlds, built on a foundation of perceived power and impunity, crumbled to dust in that single devastating instant. Brooks's jaw went slack. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale. He looked from Samuel's bruised face to Catherine's icy stare and back again, his mind frantically trying to find an exit from a nightmare that was horrifyingly real. Harlan, on the other hand, turned a deep, blotchy red. His bravado, his entire identity, was predicated on a simple hierarchy: him at the top, everyone else beneath him. That hierarchy had just been inverted with the force of a tectonic shift. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air. The smug lines on his face sagged into a mask of disbelief and panic. Only Officer Wyatt Dunn seemed to shrink into himself, as if wishing the plush leather chair would swallow him whole. He had known on some level that this meeting was not a commendation, but the reality was infinitely worse than his most anxious fears. Samuel let the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in their terror. He wanted them to understand the chasm that had opened beneath their feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous room with an intensity that was more intimidating than any shout. Last night, he began, his eyes fixed on Harlan. You told me I had rights. You asked me to prove it. Well, today I am going to prove it. Today, we are going to have a detailed discussion about my rights and about your responsibilities. He gestured to a massive screen on the wall behind him. With a click of a button from Catherine, the screen flickered to life. It showed a crystal-clear, multi-angle view of Platform B at the station. We logged the official report you filed after your shift ended, Catherine stated, picking up a tablet. Officer Harlan, you are the primary. You stated that you encountered a non-compliant and belligerent transient who, and I quote, posed a potential threat to public safety. You claimed he became verbally aggressive when asked to leave a restricted area. She paused, looking up. The platform was not a restricted area at that time. That was your first lie. The first video clip played. It was from a wide-angle security camera showing Samuel sitting quietly on the bench reading his book. The audio was clean, picking up every word. The lie about the cleaning crew? Samuel's calm, questioning tone. You also stated, Catherine continued, her voice relentless, that the subject, Mr. Kane, refused to produce a valid fare. That was your second lie. The next clip played. It was a close-up from a camera above the bench. It clearly showed Samuel presenting his fare card and Brooks snatching it and throwing it on the ground. Brooks flinched as if he had been struck. Samuel spoke again, his voice dangerously soft. Officer Brooks, your report also conveniently forgot to mention the $200 bills you helped yourself to from my wallet. We have a name for that. It is called theft. A new video appeared on screen. A tight shot from a different angle that showed with damning clarity the sleight of hand Brooks had performed, the quick fold of the bills into his palm, the casual toss of the wallet. Brooks made a choking sound, shaking his head. No, I was just securing his property. The excuse was so feeble, so pathetic, that even he did not seem to believe it. And then, Samuel said, his gaze shifting back to Harlan, we get to the most serious part of your report. You claimed I assumed a combative stance, and that you were forced to use necessary, non-lethal force to subdue the subject and effect an arrest. Let us watch your necessary force, shall we? The screen split into 4 panels, 3 different CCTV angles, and a 4th, slightly shaky view from Harlan's own body camera. He had thought he had disabled the upload, but he had forgotten about the device's internal tamper-proof storage. The boardroom was filled with the sickening sounds of the assault, the crack of the slap, Brooks's guttural punch, the thud of Samuel's body hitting the concrete, and then the methodical, brutal sounds of the nightsticks. The video was irrefutable. It was not law enforcement, it was a beating. Harlan stared at the screen, his face a mask of sweat. The man on the floor was a nameless transient. The man at the head of the table owned his entire life. The cognitive dissonance was a physical blow. You did not file an arrest report, Officer Harlan, Samuel stated, because you never arrested me. You just beat me and left me on the floor. You falsified a report to cover up a criminal assault, an assault on me, your employer. He finally turned his attention to Dunn, whose face was buried in his hands. Officer Dunn, Samuel said, his tone shifting slightly. It was still firm, but it lacked the icy fury he directed at the other two. You are new. You stood by and did nothing. Your silence made you complicit. In your report, you simply corroborated Officer Harlan's version of events. You lied. Why? Dunn looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He was trembling. I was scared, he whispered, his voice cracking. They are senior officers. Harlan, he told me how it works. You back your partner no matter what. I knew it was wrong. I did not know what to do. The right thing, officer, Samuel said simply. You do the right thing. It is often the hardest thing to do, but it is always the right thing. He stood up, wincing as he put weight on his bruised leg. He walked slowly around the table until he stood directly behind Harlan and Brooks. They could feel the heat of his anger, the sheer force of his presence. Your careers with Aegis Metro Security are over. That is the least of your concerns, Samuel said, his voice low and final. Catherine, have them escorted to the lower floor to surrender their badges, credentials, and equipment. Their access to all company property is revoked, effective immediately. As two large, stern-faced internal affairs agents entered the room, Samuel leaned down, his voice a whisper meant only for Harlan and Brooks. You thought I was nothing, a piece of trash to be discarded. You were wrong. I am the man who takes out the trash. The termination of Harlan and Brooks was not an end. It was the beginning of a corporate excavation. Samuel knew that two officers as brazen as them could not operate in a vacuum. Rot like that needed fertile ground to grow, a culture of indifference, a lack of oversight, and leadership that looked the other way. While the two disgraced officers were being processed on the lower floor, stripped of their identity and power, with a bureaucratic finality that was its own form of violence, Samuel and Catherine were back in the boardroom. The screen that had displayed the assault now showed a complex organizational chart. Harlan and Brooks were part of the Central Transit Division, Catherine explained, tapping the screen. Their direct supervisor is Captain Marcus Henderson. Henderson, 15 years with the company, the last 5 as captain. Performance reviews are consistently average. He is noted for running a tight ship with high enforcement numbers, but also has the highest rate of civilian complaints in the entire transit division, complaints that invariably are dismissed as unfounded. He is the gatekeeper, Samuel concluded. He has been burying their misconduct. He has been fostering it, Catherine corrected. High enforcement stats make him look effective. He encourages aggressive tactics. And when officers like Harlan and Brooks cross the line, he sanitizes the reports and intimidates complainants into dropping their cases. We just never had a complainant with the resources to fight back. Samuel's jaw tightened. This was the systemic failure he had feared. His undercover assessments had given him hints, whispers of a cultural problem, but the attack on him had ripped the veil away. The next step was to secure Henderson's cooperation or expose his complicity. Catherine summoned him to the executive floor under the pretext of a commendation for his division's performance. Henderson, a portly man with a self-satisfied smile, arrived expecting praise. He walked into the same boardroom, saw Samuel's bruised face, and his smile faltered. The conversation was short and brutal. Samuel did not make accusations. He presented facts. He showed Henderson a spreadsheet detailing separate excessive force complaints against Harlan and Brooks in the past few years, all of which Henderson had personally cleared. He then showed him the unaltered incident reports compared with Henderson's sanitized final versions. This looks less like oversight, Captain, and more like a cover-up, Samuel said, his voice level. Henderson began to bluster, citing protocol and union rules, but Samuel cut him off. The union cannot protect you from falsifying corporate documents, Marcus, or from being an accessory after the fact to a criminal assault. That was when Catherine slid a file across the table. It was a forensic accounting report. We pulled the division's equipment logs. Officer Brooks, for example, has reported his body camera malfunctioning during separate incidents that resulted in a civilian complaint. The odds of that are astronomical. You approved the maintenance reports every single time, no questions asked. Henderson's face turned ashen. He was trapped. You have a choice, Samuel said. You can resign, effective immediately, and we can discuss a severance package that depends entirely on your full cooperation. Or you can be terminated for cause and we can let the district attorney's office look into a potential pattern of obstruction of justice within your command. Your choice. Henderson, a man whose career was built on bullying the weak, folded completely when faced with true power. He chose to resign. His cooperation, however, was the key that unlocked everything. Over the next days, with Henderson's testimony and access codes, Samuel and Catherine's team of internal investigators descended upon the Central Transit Division. They seized computers, audited expense reports, and reviewed years of archived communications. What they found was a cesspool. It was a fiefdom run by Henderson with Harlan and Brooks as his violent enforcers. They had run a small-scale shakedown racket targeting undocumented workers and homeless individuals, confiscating cash and valuables that were never logged into evidence. They traded overtime shifts for favors. They used company resources for personal business. The most damning evidence came from Officer Wyatt Dunn. After being separated from Harlan and Brooks, the young officer, seeing a chance for redemption, confessed everything. He explained the unwritten rules of the division, how to phrase reports to avoid scrutiny, which cameras had blind spots, and how Henderson would coach them on what to say during internal reviews. He had been indoctrinated into a corrupt system from his first day. They called it keeping the peace, Dunn told Samuel in a private interview, his voice filled with shame. But it was not about peace. It was about control. It was about making sure everyone was too scared to ever question them. The investigation revealed a sickness that went right to the heart of the company's mission. Samuel had created Aegis Security with the vision of a more accountable, community-focused form of protection. He had written the ethics policies himself, but he had become disconnected, an emperor in a tower who had forgotten to walk among his own soldiers. The beating was a brutal, painful gift. It had woken him up. By the end of the week, Samuel had a clear picture of the rot. It was not just two bad officers. It was a failed captain, a culture of fear, and a system that protected predators instead of the public. Now he had to decide on the cure. And it would have to be as decisive and painful as the disease itself. The karma that befell Vance Harlan and Tanner Brooks was not a single swift event, but a slow, methodical dismantling of their entire lives. Samuel understood that simply firing them was insufficient. Justice in this case needed to be public, legal, and educational. The first step was criminal. Armed with the irrefutable video evidence and the full confession of Officer Dunn, Samuel's legal team met with the district attorney. This was not a case of a civilian against the police, a scenario often fraught with bias. This was a corporation turning on its own criminal employees, providing a perfectly packaged case. The DA, seeing a high-profile slam-dunk conviction, pressed charges immediately. Harlan and Brooks were arrested not in a quiet office, but at their homes in front of their families and neighbors. The charges were severe: aggravated assault, robbery for the stolen cash, and falsifying official reports. Their union provided lawyers, but the defense was hopeless against the mountain of evidence. The body camera footage was played in open court, their smug cruelty laid bare for the world to see. Officer Dunn, granted immunity for his testimony, was the prosecution's star witness, his shame-faced account sealing their fate. They were found guilty on all counts. Harlan received a sentence of 5 years in state prison. Brooks, given his additional charge of theft, received 7. The two men who had built their identities on projecting power were stripped of everything, reduced to inmates in a system they once smugly represented. Captain Marcus Henderson's reckoning was quieter but no less complete. He avoided criminal charges in exchange for his testimony, but his career was in ashes. He was forced to surrender his security licenses, making him unemployable in the industry he had worked in his entire adult life. The severance he received was minimal, and the whisper of his disgrace followed him, turning him into a pariah in law enforcement circles. He ended up as a night shift manager at a discount warehouse, a ghost of the authority figure he once was. For Officer Wyatt Dunn, the path was more complex. Samuel saw in him not a villain, but a young man who had failed a critical moral test. He was fired from Aegis Security. His complicity could not be ignored. But Samuel also saw a chance for redemption. After the trial, Samuel met with him one last time. "You did the right thing in the end," Samuel told him, "but you need to understand why you did not do it sooner." Samuel personally paid for Dunn to enroll in counseling and ethics courses. He gave him a second chance, not in security, but in a logistics role at one of his other non-security related companies, far from any position of authority. It was a chance to rebuild, to learn, and to prove that his moral failure was a lesson, not a life sentence. But Samuel knew that punishing the guilty was only half the battle. The true work was in fixing the system that had allowed them to flourish. The karma had to extend to the company itself. He initiated a top-to-bottom overhaul of Aegis Metro security. He fired the entire leadership of the Central Transit Division. He brought in Catherine Beck as the new interim head, tasking her with rebuilding it from the ground up. The changes were radical. A new independent civilian oversight board was created with the power to investigate any and all complaints completely outside the company's chain of command. Body camera policies were rewritten. Any malfunction during a use-of-force incident was now an automatic cause for suspension pending an investigation. Samuel invested millions in new training programs, moving away from a focus on enforcement and toward de-escalation and crisis intervention. He instituted mandatory anonymous cultural health surveys for all employees, designed to flag problematic supervisors and toxic work environments before they could fester. Most significantly, he changed the company's metrics for success. Enforcement and arrest numbers were de-emphasized. Instead, supervisors and divisions were now judged on positive community interactions, reductions in civilian complaints, and successful de-escalation events. He was changing the very definition of a good officer. The process was painful and expensive. Some veteran officers resistant to the new culture resigned. The union pushed back, but Samuel was unyielding. He used the story of what happened to him without ever naming himself publicly as a cautionary tale in every training session, a stark reminder of how easily power could corrupt and how devastating the consequences could be. He had felt the failure of his own creation on his own skin, in his own bones, and he was determined to forge something better from the wreckage. By the end of the year, the new culture was taking root. Samuel stood before the entire graduating class of Aegis Metro Security's new recruits. The auditorium was filled with fresh faces, men and women from diverse backgrounds, all dressed in the crisp, redesigned Aegis uniform, which now featured a more prominent, easily readable name and badge number. Samuel himself looked different. The bruises had long since faded, but the experience had left a permanent mark on his soul, one that manifested as a new, formidable gravity in his presence. He still wore his expensive suits, but he moved with the awareness of a man who knew how fragile the barrier was between the boardroom and the cold concrete floor. He stood at the podium, not behind it. He wanted no barrier between himself and his people. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and resonant, filling the large hall. "Today you are joining an organization that is in the process of being reborn, and I want to tell you why." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Last year, our company failed. It failed in its mission. It failed the city it is paid to protect, and it failed its own core principles. We had officers who saw their uniform not as a symbol of responsibility, but as a shield for their cruelty. We had a system that valued statistics over humanity. We had a culture that protected the corrupt and silenced the decent." A nervous murmur rippled through the recruits. This was not the typical corporate pep talk. "That failure had a cost," Samuel continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It cost people their dignity. It cost people their safety. It cost me broken ribs." The admission landed with a quiet thud. He did not elaborate on the details. He did not have to. The story was now a legend within the company, a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms and break rooms. The owner had gone undercover and been beaten by his own men. "I tell you this not to scare you, but to impress upon you the weight of the badge you are about to receive. The authority it grants you is not yours. It is a loan. It is loaned to you by the people of this city, and it can be revoked. I revoked it from the men who failed that test. I will revoke it from any one of you who does the same." He began to pace slowly in front of the stage, his voice filled with a passion that was both raw and controlled. "Your job is not to be warriors. It is to be guardians. Your primary tool is not the baton at your hip. It is the respect in your voice. Your greatest skill will not be subduing a suspect. It will be de-escalating a crisis so that no one has to get hurt. You will be judged not by the number of arrests you make, but by the number of times you make an arrest unnecessary. He stopped and looked at them one by one. Some of you will be tested. You will have bad days. You will face anger and fear. You may even have a partner or a supervisor who encourages you to take shortcuts, to bend the rules, to forget your humanity. In that moment, I want you to remember this. Doing the right thing is not a suggestion. It is the entire job description. And if you see a fellow officer failing that test, your silence is not loyalty. It is betrayal. It is a betrayal of your oath, a betrayal of the public, and a betrayal of this company. He walked back to the center of the stage. Aegis Metro Security is being rebuilt on a new foundation. That foundation is accountability. It is transparency. It is respect. You, this class, are the first bricks in that new wall. Make it a strong one. He concluded his speech, and for a moment the room was silent. Then a single recruit stood up and began to clap. Soon another joined, and then another, until the entire auditorium was filled with a thunderous, heartfelt ovation. It was not the polite applause of a corporate gathering. It was the sound of a new beginning, a promise from a new generation of officers to their leader, who had walked through the fire and was now showing them the way out of the darkness. Samuel Kane, the man who had been beaten down on one of his own platforms, stood before them not just as a CEO, but as the living embodiment of the lesson they all needed to learn. True strength is not the power to inflict pain, but the courage to heal the wounds, starting with your own. The story of Samuel Kane is a stark reminder that the systems we build are only as strong as the integrity of the people within them. It is a powerful testament to the idea that true justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about having the courage to tear down a broken structure and build something better in its place. He turned a moment of brutal victimization into a catalyst for profound systemic change, proving that one person's commitment to principle can reshape an entire culture. His journey shows us that sometimes you have to feel the deepest flaws of your own creation to find the strength to fix them. What did you think of this story of hard-earned karma? If you were moved by this tale of justice and accountability, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where the overlooked and underestimated rise up to reclaim their power. Comment below with your thoughts on what true leadership looks like.